So the question arises, when is Bernie Sanders going to directly confront Elizabeth Warren? And the answer, I think, there is a bit complicated. I think Bernie himself is not personally inclined to go after Warren in any kind of sustained way. But on the other hand, he's often happy to raise points of departure between himself and other candidates on policy. And he's already done that a number of times with Joe Biden. He also did that maybe somewhat tepidly, but he still did it with Hillary Clinton in 2016. And the latest polling indicates that Warren does seem to be eating into Bernie's core constituency, at least in Iowa, and therefore poses a significant political problem to him, maybe more so than people had assumed, because there was this theory that Warren and Sanders were operating in different, quote, lanes, even though that they were putatively viewed as progressives and therefore occupying the same lane. The idea was that Warren and Sanders had different demographic support bases, and voters weren't inclined necessarily to think of them in terms of progressivism or of their ideological label, and therefore their constituencies were not as overlapping as might have been thought earlier on. But now it does seem as though that there is some overlap there, and Warren is siphoning key support from Sanders. So in the latest Iowa poll released yesterday by Selzer, which is generally seen as the gold standard poll in Iowa, I don't want to get into all the disputes about whether polling science is valid. I'm just going to operate under the assumption that this poll in particular anyway is legitimate. But one of the findings that didn't get a whole lot of attention, Warren is in the lead at 22%, Biden at 20%, Sanders at 11%. But aside from those top line figures, here's a data point that I think speaks to why Bernie is increasingly in a position where he's going to have to, at the very least, draw distinctions between himself and Warren. Among voters who caucused for Hillary in 2016, Warren is at 22%, Sanders at 0%. I'll repeat that. Among voters in Iowa who caucused for Hillary Clinton in 2016, Warren is at 22%, Sanders 0%. Now, that's not particularly surprising, I guess, on the surface, but then again, it would be surprising if it were any other runner-up from the previous cycle, because you'd expect that at least some portion of the voters who supported the opponent in the previous presidential cycle would gravitate toward the runner-up. But in Sanders' case, that's just not happening, and not happening to a stark, glaring degree, given that he's not 2%, 4%, 8%, right? He's at 0% by that metric, whereas Warren obviously is showcasing a potential to generate appeal from across factions within the party, and that's valuable for somebody who wants to at least win a plurality of delegates to secure the nomination. On top of that, and this is probably even more glaring, among Sanders' caucus goers in 2016, so Iowa voters who caucused for Bernie Sanders in 2016, Warren is also leading. So she's ahead of Sanders, 32 to 25%, among voters who caucused for Bernie in the last cycle. Now, if that doesn't underscore that Bernie has a particular political problem with Warren, then I don't know what would, because that is striking. And then, furthermore, among voters under 35, she's also ahead, 27 to 22%. Voters under 35 were Bernie's bread and butter in 2016. They were the reason he had any viability whatsoever, really, because the discrepancy between him and Hillary was so lopsided, historically so, in 2016 among young voters. And Warren's eating into that constituency as well. And her trajectory is upward in all these metrics, whereas Bernie is either stagnating or even declining somewhat according to a variety of metrics, with the exception of fundraising, where Bernie is light years ahead of pretty much everybody in terms of small donor contributions, just having passed the 1 million metric this past week. So that's part of the reason why whenever there is a somewhat bearish polling figure that comes out for Bernie, my sort of mental handicap, or that's not a good way to put it, but the way that I sort of handicap the situation is that I tack on maybe 2, 3, 4, something like that, percentage points to Bernie's total to account for the intangible factors that I think militate in his favor, such as the enthusiasm that he generates, which is still unique among the candidates, such as the network of small donors that he has, such as the organizational infrastructure that he has in place nationwide, but most importantly in the early states. So I kind of just make a little adjustment to whatever I see his polling total is and add 2 or 3 or 4%. But that would still only put him in the, at like 14%, which is not enough to win the Iowa caucus, especially in light of Warren's steady upward trajectory in terms of favorability, in terms of people who are considering her. Remember, in order to, in the Iowa caucus, you have to pass the 15% threshold in any given caucus site in order for the votes for your candidate to count. So the fact that Warren is considered the first or second choice by now a significant plurality of voters speaks well of her chances, barring any unforeseen developments, right? We're still, 4 months away? So plenty could happen, but the trend lines look good for Warren and not the greatest for Bernie with the qualifiers that I mentioned. Now, all this, again, brings up the question, how is Bernie going to handle this political problem, which so obviously now he is facing with respect to Warren? The two of them are obviously cordial. They are in regular contact with one another, it seems. They regard one another as ideological allies, which is different from how Bernie and Hillary regarded one another in 2016. But nonetheless, Bernie wants to win. His supporters desperately want him to win. And so there has to be some kind of tactical evaluation here as to what the best course of action would be with regard to Warren. And sort of a precursor to that is looking at how their online supporters are interacting. The Working Families Party endorsed Warren this past week, and Bernie supporters were understandably suspicious about this because the Working Families Party refused to release the precise vote tabulations between the leadership of the party, which counts for half of the vote total for the endorsement process, and then the rank and file, or the membership, which accounts for 50% as well. So the suspicion was, which is probably justified, that the leadership in the party tipped it to Warren and finagled their way to an endorsement on that basis, whereas in 2015, they endorsed Bernie by a large margin. So in the wake of that, you had Bernie supporters registering their discontent on the internet, and maybe a few of them were mean, maybe some of them were nasty, but this idea that there was this upsurge in abuse or harassment or violent threats, I mean, that's just the same old tired routine that we saw in 2016 to a tediously overblown extent with the whole Bernie bro myth, which held that whenever journalists scanned their social media feeds, or if they looked at Reddit and they found some kind of cantankerous pro-Bernie statement, they would then concoct that into this self-serving narrative where they were the victims and the hordes of Bernie supporters were harassing them. And that meant that there was something uniquely hateful about Bernie's support base, and then they used that to demand disavowals, quote unquote, from the Bernie campaign. Now, you think that myth would have been dispelled at this point, but apparently not. It's just taken on a different form, because in the wake of the Working Families Party episode, this coalition of leaders put out a statement in defense of the Working Families Party, accusing self-identified Bernie supporters, they claimed, of engaging in violent, hateful, or racist attacks against them, because apparently many more now of the leadership in the Working Families Party are non-white, so therefore the claim is that they have been attacked because they are not white, which I don't know why Bernie supporters out of anybody in the world would want to attack anybody on those grounds, but that was the claim. And so in this letter that they released, they accused Bernie supporters of engaging in white terror, and they just cited generic examples of this, which you could not independently verify. So they claim that these attacks were rampant, right? But if that were to be true, you'd want to, for journalistic reasons or just for reasons of basic ethics, you'd want to go through and verify the provenance of those attacks, who exactly leveled them, was it just a troll, was it a Bernie supporter? It could be anybody on the internet. And even if it was a Bernie supporter, could you then extrapolate that into this grandiose narrative about how Bernie supporters are uniquely prone to racist attacks? I mean, which is just so absurd. But the reason why that no specific concrete examples were cited in that letter, I deduced, was because they know how self-evidently crazy and ridiculous it is to send such a letter on the basis of effectively random Twitter users whose identity they could not ascertain. Making such a harsh, denunciatory comment about the Bernie Sanders campaign on the basis of random Twitter users is lazy, one, and it's also not amenable to independent verification. But they kind of, wiggle their way out of that admission in the letter and just use this kind of brash, moralizing rhetoric so that people wouldn't look at it critically and understand that what they were doing was simply reacting to a very selective interpretation of online commentary, probably largely from anonymous users, after a controversial political decision that was made by the Working Families Party. If you make controversial political decisions, chances are there are going to be people online who are not happy about it, and they will register that sentiment accordingly. That's nothing new. It's going to happen forever. But they demanded this disavowal from the Bernie campaign, and the Bernie campaign obliged. They put out a tweet saying they don't condone racist abuse, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Obviously, they don't condone that. That was never a question. But what they did, the Bernie campaign, what they did in acceding to that demand was that they granted leverage to bad faith actors who could use that illogical argument against them at any possible juncture now. Because they know that it got results. The attack, the criticism didn't make any sense, but nonetheless, they succeeded in extracting an apology of sorts from the candidate. So that means that they know now that they have this leverage over the campaign, and they will deploy that same tedious, inane logic at some other point in the future, which nobody should have any doubt about. That's going to be coming. It probably won't be through Warren's campaign, or at least Warren herself, probably through surrogates, probably through media supporters. But in terms of the online conflict that's going to be raging between Hillary and Bernie supporters, one of the main fronts is going to be this whole harassment theory that suggests that Bernie supporters are uniquely harassing or violent or racist online, which, again, is just too ridiculous to even really address on the merits, but unfortunately you have to because it's that prevalent in the media and among activists. So get ready for a confrontation that presages the Bernie Warren confrontation in terms of their online support bases, because that's heating up. And one of the paradoxical elements of all this is that Biden is still technically in the lead, at least nationally, and he has no online supporters really, or nobody who has a prominent platform on social media. So he could just kind of sit out all this drama and just skate by, because there's nobody who's really rising to Biden's defense online in the social media discourse anyway. Biden supporters generally are not waging war on Twitter. They tend to be lucky if they can work the TV remote, as I like to say. So don't expect the Biden support base to really be in the mix there. It's going to be this Cold War type scenario between Warren and Bernie supporters, and eventually you got to assume that's going to spill out into how the candidates themselves discuss the issues and one another. But we will have to see. So I'll talk to you later.